In the winter of 1258, the skies above Baghdad turned black. Smoke rose where once stood libraries, observatories, and palaces, the treasures of 1,000 years devoured in days. The Mongol horsemen, led by Hulagu Khan, had unleashed a storm the world would never forget. The Tigris ran dark with ink from destroyed manuscripts, and the city once called the jewel of the world was left silent, broken and burning. Yet before the fire, there was light. 2 centuries earlier, Baghdad had been the very center of human brilliance. Within its walls, ideas crossed oceans and faiths. Scholars debated the stars, doctors dissected knowledge itself, and poets captured the pulse of creation. From Spain to Persia, a civilization once forged in the deserts had built a world driven not by conquest alone, but by curiosity, tolerance, and the relentless pursuit of truth. This is the story of that world, the Islamic Golden Age. An era when Muslims, Christians, and Jews worked side by side in the pursuit of knowledge, when rulers built libraries larger than palaces, when science and faith walked hand in hand, until ambition and betrayal tore them apart. In the century following the Prophet Muhammad's passing, the Arabian Peninsula transformed from a collection of tribes into one of the most formidable empires in history. Fueled by unity under Islam and guided by a sense of divine purpose, armies swept through Persia, the Levant, Egypt, and North Africa. Yet the real transformation wasn't on the battlefield. It was in the mind. When the Abbasid dynasty seized power in 750 CE, they inherited not just lands but legacies: Persian governance, Greek philosophy, Indian mathematics. The new caliphs, descendants of the Prophet's uncle Abbas, sought not merely to rule, but to understand. And at the heart of their empire, they would build a city that symbolized both power and intellect: Baghdad. Caliph al-Mansur, the empire's visionary founder, chose the site along the Tigris River. "Here," he said, "will stand the city of peace." The design itself was circular, a reflection of cosmic harmony, with the caliph's palace at the center. Surrounded by markets, gardens, and mosques, Baghdad wasn't built just as a capital. It was conceived as a message to the world that Islam could unite faith with reason, the sword with the pen. The Abbasids ruled through intellect as much as force. They adopted Persian administration, promoted scholars, and established Arabic as the lingua franca of knowledge. In their courts, translators from distant lands brought scrolls written in Greek, Sanskrit, and Syriac, texts that might have been lost forever had they not found refuge in this new empire of ideas. But behind this, brilliance was ambition, and ambition always has a price. For even as Baghdad rose in light, shadows gathered in its corners. Power attracted envy, wealth bred corruption, and somewhere within the glittering palaces, the seeds of betrayal were quietly taking root. By the late 8th century, Baghdad had become more than a capital. It was the world's beating intellectual heart. Under Caliph al-Mansur's successors, especially the brilliant al-Mamun, the city drew minds from every corner of the known world. Persians, Arabs, Greeks, Syriacs, and Jews converged here, united by a single creed. That knowledge itself was divine. At dawn, the city shimmered with a golden hue. Merchants filled the souks with silks from China and spices from India. Poets gathered in tea houses, arguing meter and meaning. But in a quiet quarter near the Tigris, something far greater stirred. The Beit al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom. No single building symbolized the Golden Age more than this one. Its walls contained the thoughts of Aristotle, the geometry of Euclid, the medicine of Galen. Inside, scribes copied by hand, translators whispered across tongues, and scholars debated under the flicker of oil lamps that never seemed to go out. The Caliph al-Mamun had founded this institution not out of whim, but conviction. He believed knowledge was the truest form of worship. Legends say he once dreamed of Aristotle, who told him, "Between reason and faith, there is no conflict." Al-Mamun woke determined to prove it true. Teams of translators led by Hunayn ibn Ishaq, a Nestorian Christian fluent in Arabic, Syriac, and Greek, began the monumental task of rendering the wisdom of antiquity into Arabic. Each translation was an act of resurrection. Forgotten ideas were reborn in a new tongue, polished and annotated for future generations. When Hunayn translated Galen's medical texts, he didn't merely copy, he corrected and clarified, comparing multiple manuscripts. Baghdad wasn't just preserving knowledge, it was refining it. Nearby, another man began shaping the modern world in ways few could imagine. His name was Muhammad ibn Musa al-Khwarizmi, a quiet mathematician with an insatiable mind. Al-Khwarizmi worked within the House of Wisdom's geometry rooms, surrounded by scrolls on numbers and stars. He studied Indian arithmetic, Persian astronomy, and Greek geometry, then fused them into something entirely new: algebra. He introduced the concept of the zero, a placeholder so simple yet so revolutionary that it transformed every field of mathematics. From Baghdad's ink-stained tables, his ideas would travel centuries ahead, influencing scholars from Fibonacci to Newton. His name, transliterated into Latin, would give birth to a modern word: algorithm. Every discovery seemed to echo through the marble halls. Astronomers recalculated planetary motions with instruments of breathtaking precision. Physicians studied anatomy and experimented with new methods of surgery. Chemists, then called alchemists, refined substances in search not only of gold but of understanding. And above all, there was a sense of unity. Muslims, Christians, Jews, and Zoroastrians worked side by side, their collaboration proving that truth belonged to no single creed. The Quran's first command, read, was their anthem. In Baghdad, even the night sky was a classroom. Scholars built observatories that rivaled palaces. Under Caliph al-Ma'mun, astronomers such as al-Farghani and Yahya ibn Abi Mansur charted the heavens, calculating the Earth's circumference within astonishing accuracy. Some even suggested that stars might be distant suns, a thought so bold it would take Europe 800 years to echo it. But beyond the scholars' lamps, politics simmered. The caliphate's prosperity attracted envy from its provinces. The empire stretched from Spain to Central Asia, too vast for any one man to hold. Governors grew ambitious. Rival dynasties whispered rebellion. Yet within Baghdad's walls, the pursuit of knowledge continued, as if intellect itself could defy the world's chaos. Then, the first tremor came. A growing debate began to divide the thinkers of the city. Some claimed reason could explain creation. Others warned that faith must remain supreme. This tension, subtle at first, would one day consume the empire from within. Still, for now, Baghdad remained radiant. Travelers wrote of streets lit by torches at night, of libraries open to the public, of women teaching in courts and hospitals. The caliphs funded astronomical towers and medical schools, sending scholars abroad to collect manuscripts. When one scholar returned from Byzantium, it was said al-Ma'mun paid him the weight of each scroll in gold. The city seemed eternal, untouchable, a monument to the idea that human reason could approach divine understanding. No one yet knew how fragile that light truly was, for in the pursuit of truth, even brilliance cast shadows. The 9th and 10th centuries were Baghdad's zenith, an age when thought itself seemed limitless. Scholars from the House of Wisdom spread across the empire, founding schools in Damascus, Cairo, Cordoba, and Nishapur. The ripple of intellect became a tide. Among the towering minds of this era stood Abu Bakr al-Razi, known in the West as Razis. Once an alchemist and musician, al-Razi turned to medicine, questioning long-held traditions. Where others relied on superstition, he demanded proof. He wrote hundreds of treatises, including Kitab al-Hawi, a vast medical encyclopedia. Al-Razi's most daring act was his skepticism. He challenged Galen's ancient medical teachings when evidence contradicted them. To him, knowledge was not to be memorized but tested. When asked to choose the site for a new hospital in Baghdad, he hung pieces of meat across the city. The spot where the meat decayed slowest, he declared, had the cleanest air, the perfect place to heal. A century later came Ibn Sina, Avicenna, the polymath who would bridge medicine, philosophy, and metaphysics. Born in Persia, he mastered logic by 10, medicine by 16, and wrote by candlelight while his peers slept. His canon of medicine became the definitive medical text for both the Islamic world and medieval Europe. But Ibn Sina's genius was dangerous. He dared to reconcile Greek philosophy with Islamic theology, arguing that reason was a reflection of divine truth. To conservative scholars, his ideas bordered on heresy. To others, they represented humanity's highest calling, to understand creation through the lens of intellect. Not far behind was al-Biruni, historian, mathematician, astronomer, and explorer. He measured the Earth's radius with near-modern accuracy and theorized about the rotation of our planet. He studied tides, eclipses, and languages with an objectivity rare for his time. He saw no contradiction between faith and science. Both, he said, were paths to the same truth. In the laboratories of Baghdad, another revolution unfolded. Chemists such as Jabir ibn Hayyan laid the foundations of modern chemistry: distillation, crystallization, and acid extraction. His works on balance, experimentation, and reproducibility became the seeds of the scientific method itself. Even philosophy reached new heights. Thinkers like al-Farabi, the second teacher after Aristotle, explored logic, politics, and music theory, envisioning an ideal society governed by reason. His writings would later influence Thomas Aquinas and Dante alike. It was a world intoxicated by knowledge. Libraries multiplied. Manuscripts crossed borders faster than armies. Cordoba alone held over 500,000 volumes. In Bukhara, students memorized not just scripture, but the works of Aristotle and Ptolemy. Yet with every revelation came friction. The very openness that fueled progress also bred doubt among those who saw the old order slipping. Preachers began to warn that philosophy could corrupt faith. Theologians accused scholars of arrogance, of seeking to rival God's creation with equations and logic. Still, the scholars persisted. They believed truth was not the enemy of belief, but its completion. Al-Razi wrote, "The seeker of truth must doubt all things until reason finds certainty." For a time, reason triumphed. Caliphs still funded observatories and libraries, but as wealth poured in, decadence followed. The Abbasid elite grew distant from the scholars who had built their glory. Power shifted from thinkers to courtiers, from reason to rhetoric. Whispers began in the mosques. Had the empire grown too proud? Had it forgotten humility before God? Soon those whispers would become shouts, and the golden brilliance of inquiry would face its greatest trial. By the 9th century's end, the brilliance of Baghdad had drawn not only scholars, but storms. The same empire that had once united faith and intellect now stood at a crossroads. Curiosity and conviction began to clash, not as enemies of truth, but as rivals for its definition. The Caliph al-Ma'mun, who had championed reason and the sciences, faced a deepening divide among his theologians. A new movement, the Mu'tazilites, argued that reason itself was sacred, that human logic could discern divine truth. They believed the Quran was created, not eternal, and that understanding God required intellect as much as faith. It was a radical idea, empowering, liberating, and deeply unsettling to traditionalists. For centuries, Islam had thrived on unity, but now the question of how to interpret the divine word threatened to fracture it. Al-Ma'mun chose a side. In 833 CE, he declared the Mihna, an inquisition that would test the empire's religious scholars on their beliefs. Those who refused the Mu'tazilite doctrine were imprisoned, beaten, or silenced. For the first time, Baghdad's scholars faced persecution not for ignorance, but for what they thought. The paradox was cruel. The caliph, who built the House of Wisdom, had turned reason into a weapon. Among the victims stood Ahmad ibn Hanbal, a quiet but unyielding scholar who refused to bend. His defiance made him a symbol for those who saw the caliph's rationalism as arrogance before God. The people, weary of theological complexity, began to rally behind the traditionalists. Faith, they said, required submission, not debate. When al-Ma'mun died, the pendulum swung. His successors abandoned the Mihna. The Mu'tazilites fell from power and orthodoxy reclaimed its throne. But something had changed forever. The empire's relationship with knowledge had been scarred. What once was a garden of ideas now carried walls, invisible but strong. Scholars learned caution. Questions once spoken aloud were whispered in secrecy. Still, the flame of intellect refused to die. New voices emerged, philosophers like al-Ghazali, who sought to reconcile faith with reason once more. In his masterpiece, The Incoherence of the Philosophers, al-Ghazali argued that logic had limits. Human reason could not fully grasp divine will. For him, philosophy was a ladder, useful but dangerous if climbed too high. His words resonated deeply across the Islamic world. To some, they were a necessary balance. To others, a death sentence for inquiry. But the conversation did not end there. Another scholar, Ibn Rushd, Averroes of Cordoba, rose in response. In The Incoherence of the Incoherence, he defended philosophy fiercely, claiming that understanding creation was itself an act of faith. There, debate stretched across continents and centuries, a dialogue that defined the intellectual, soul of Islam and later echoed through Europe's Renaissance. Yet, while minds clashed in manuscripts, empires shifted in blood and gold. The Abbasids' vast dominion began to fragment. Governors in North Africa, Persia, and Egypt declared independence. The Fatimids in Cairo and the Umayyads in Al-Andalus claimed rival caliphates. The unity that once nurtured the Golden Age crumbled under ambition, and with division came decline. Funding for scholarship waned as the caliphs struggled to maintain power. Libraries fell into neglect, scribes went unpaid, and scientific instruments rusted. The House of Wisdom still stood, but its spirit dimmed. Baghdad, once the heart of light, became a battlefield of ideas without a referee. Rationalists accused theologians of fear. Theologians accused philosophers of arrogance. Both forgot that their ancestors had once walked the same path together. The empire's scholars turned inward, some toward mysticism, others toward survival. The Sufis emerged, seeking truth through experience rather than intellect. In their poetry and devotion, they preserved a different kind of wisdom, one rooted in humility and love. Their verses spoke not of stars or equations, but of the soul's journey to the divine. By the dawn of the 11th century, the world had changed. The Abbasids' authority was hollow, their power overshadowed by the Seljuk Turks, who ruled in their name. The caliph's palace remained, but his influence had become ceremonial. Still, even in decay, the echoes of greatness lingered. In every corner of the Islamic world, from Cordoba's libraries to Samarkand's observatories, the memory of Baghdad's light endured. The empire's scholars had once dared to believe that truth was universal. Now, that dream flickered, fragile, contested, and nearly forgotten. And yet, as history would prove, the end of an age rarely comes with silence. It comes with betrayal. The betrayal was not sudden. It was gradual, inevitable, and deeply human. The Abbasid Caliphate, once stretching from the Atlantic to the Indus, had become a patchwork of rival thrones. Provinces acted as kingdoms, generals crowned themselves sultans. Power that once radiated from Baghdad now bled outward, diluted by distance and distrust. Gold still flowed into the city, but so did corruption. Courtiers competed for favor, viziers schemed for control, and the caliphs themselves, heirs of al-Ma'mun and al-Mansur, became prisoners of their own palaces. The empire's wealth, once used to fund observatories and libraries, now built pleasure gardens and private armies. The scholars who had once advised rulers were replaced by flatterers and mystics, promising divine legitimacy. Abdication of intellect came quietly, not as decree, but as neglect. Meanwhile, the world beyond the empire began to shift. In the West, Europe stirred. Latin translations of Arabic texts began crossing into Spain. Ideas that had been born in Baghdad found new life in Toledo, Palermo, and Paris. Ibn Sina's medical teachings shaped European universities. Al-Khwarizmi's mathematics became the backbone of modern science. Ironically, the Islamic Golden Age had ignited the very Renaissance that would later eclipse it. But within the empire, shadows deepened. The Fatimid Caliphate in Egypt challenged Abbasid authority, claiming descent from the Prophet's daughter Fatima. Their rise fractured the Muslim world along sectarian lines, Sunni against Shia, Baghdad against Cairo. Even as trade and knowledge connected their cities, politics tore them apart. Then came the Crusades. When European knights stormed into the Levant in 1099, their victory shocked the Islamic world. Jerusalem fell, and the call for unity resounded across the fractured lands. Scholars turned to chroniclers like Usama ibn Munkid, who recorded the clash not just of swords, but of civilizations. The Crusades revealed what the Abbasids had become, a divided house. Provinces acted alone, emirs hoarded power. The caliph in Baghdad could issue proclamations, but no one listened. Saladin's rise in Egypt briefly rekindled the dream of unity. His victory at Hattin in 1187 and the recapture of Jerusalem restored faith in Islamic power. But even his triumph could not heal the empire's deeper wounds. Betrayal came next, quiet, internal, and devastating. In 1250, the Abbasids made a fatal miscalculation. Seeking protection, they invited the Mongols, fierce warriors from the steppes, into their political games. What they saw as allies were in truth predators. The Mongols watched, learned, and waited. Their emissaries rode through the cities of Islam, studying fortifications and wealth. When they finally turned eastward, their vengeance would be absolute. By the mid-13th century, Baghdad still glittered, but its soul was hollow. The House of Wisdom stood neglected, its scrolls gathering dust. The great observatories no longer charted the stars, and far beyond the mountains a storm was rising, vast, unstoppable, and merciless. Its name was Hulagu Khan. In the winter of 1258, the world's most brilliant city awaited its end without knowing it. Baghdad, once the crown of civilization, had weathered invasions before. Persians, Turks, Crusaders, but nothing in its 8 centuries of splendor had prepared it for what was coming from the east. The Mongol horde under Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis, was no ordinary army. It was a force of nature, tens of thousands of riders moving like one organism, driven by vengeance and ambition. Hulagu had been commanded by his brother, the great Khan Munka, to destroy the Muslim world's centers of resistance. Baghdad, seat of the Abbasid Caliphate, was his ultimate target. The Caliph al-Mustasim, descendant of the dynasty that had ruled for 5 centuries, received Hulagu's envoys with arrogance. He was confident that Baghdad's walls, its prestige, and its prayers would protect it. The envoys demanded submission, tribute, loyalty, and surrender. The Caliph refused. Some say he even mocked the Mongols, sending back empty words instead of gold. It was the gravest mistake in Islamic history. In January 1258, Hulagu surrounded the city with a precision that stunned even the survivors who lived to tell it. His forces dammed the Tigris, diverting its waters to flood the surrounding land and trap the inhabitants. Siege engines, catapults, mangonels, and towers encircled the city. For 7 days, the sky was alive with fire. Inside the walls, panic spread like plague. The city that had once debated the nature of the stars now trembled in silence. Its scholars hid their manuscripts. Mothers prayed. The caliph's court, once filled with poets and philosophers, descended into fear. On the 8th day, the Mongols breached the walls. What followed defied imagination. Baghdad, the city of peace, was consumed by chaos. The Mongols showed no mercy. For a week they slaughtered without distinction. Men, women, Children, scholars, soldiers. The caliph was captured and paraded through his own palace, his courtiers forced to bow before his conqueror. Hulagu ordered that he be executed without spilling royal blood. Wrapped in a carpet, the last Abbasid caliph was trampled beneath horses, the symbol of Mongol conquest, crushing the legacy of Islam's greatest dynasty. Then, the destruction began. The House of Wisdom, the repository of centuries of thought, was ransacked. Its books, works of philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, and medicine, were thrown into the Tigris. The river turned black with ink, thick as oil. Witnesses said the waters ran dark for days, as if mourning the death of reason itself. The observatories were torn down, the libraries burned, the air filled with ash and smoke. Baghdad, the city that had once measured the stars, could no longer see them. In a single week, an age ended. Scholars who survived the sack wrote of the silence that followed. A silence not of peace, but of absence. The Mongols moved on, leaving behind a wasteland where the world's brightest light had once burned. But even amidst ruin, fragments endured. Some scholars fled east, carrying manuscripts in secret. Others escaped west to Damascus, Cairo, or Andalusia, preserving what they could. A few, taken captive, shared their knowledge in foreign courts. The wisdom of Baghdad did not die that winter. It scattered like embers on the wind. For centuries afterward, travelers spoke of the fall as a turning point, not just for Islam, but for humanity. Never again would such a concentration of intellect, art, and curiosity exist in one city. And yet the irony was bitter. The Mongols who destroyed Baghdad would, within a generation, convert to Islam themselves. The conquerors would adopt the faith of the conquered, building new centers of learning in Tabriz, Maraga, and later Samarkand. Knowledge, though wounded, found new vessels. Still, the heart of the Golden Age had stopped beating. The caliphate, once a symbol of unity and progress, became memory. The empire that had taught Europe to think, to heal, to calculate, was gone. But history rarely ends cleanly. Even ashes carry echoes. After Baghdad's fall, the Islamic world reeled. Cities like Damascus and Cairo became new sanctuaries for scholars, but none could replace what was lost. The libraries of the Golden Age had contained not just books, but continuity, the thread of inquiry that tied civilizations together. And yet, that thread did not break entirely. It stretched westward, across North Africa, into Al-Andalus, Muslim Spain, where the light flickered anew. In Cordoba, Seville, and Granada, the torch of knowledge passed to a new generation. Scholars translated Arabic works into Latin and Hebrew, reintroducing Aristotle, Galen, and Ptolemy to a Europe that had forgotten them. From this rebirth came a paradox. The Renaissance, the age of Leonardo and Copernicus, owed its spark to the ashes of Baghdad. The equations of al-Khwarizmi, the optics of Ibn al-Haytham, the medicine of Ibn Sina, all became pillars of Western thought. Even the term algorithm, born from a scholar of the Caliphate, became the foundation of our digital world. The world had changed form, but not essence. Knowledge had crossed borders, survived translations, and outlived its empires. In Cairo, the Mamluks rose from the ruins of the Abbasids' power, forming their own centers of learning. The scholars who fled Baghdad helped build new institutions like the madrasa system, ensuring that education remained sacred. In Persia, poets like Rumi and Hafez transformed philosophy into verse, turning loss into beauty. The scientific became spiritual. The rational became poetic. Even the Mongols' descendants, the Ilkhanids, turned from destruction to curiosity. They built observatories, restored trade, and commissioned maps of the known world. It was as if the very empire that had ended an age could not escape its allure. The Islamic Golden Age had burned out, but its afterglow illuminated the centuries that followed. It proved a truth older than any empire. Ideas do not die when cities fall. They find new homes, new tongues, new dreamers. When Europe rediscovered Aristotle, it was through Arabic manuscripts. When hospitals spread across Christendom, they followed the blueprints of Baghdad's healers. When universities rose in Bologna and Paris, they echoed the structure of madrasas. The Renaissance was, in many ways, the second flowering of a seed planted in the East. Still, the loss lingered. Even centuries later, historians would speak of Baghdad with reverence, as though it were not a place, but an idea, a civilization that proved brilliance could emerge from faith, and faith could coexist with reason. But the story of the Islamic Golden Age is not one of tragedy alone. It is a reminder that every civilization carries both light and shadow. That curiosity is fragile, yet indestructible. And perhaps most hauntingly, that betrayal of ideals, of unity, of reason, is always an inside job. As the centuries passed, travelers stood on the banks of the Tigris and spoke of the ink that once darkened its waters. They imagined the scrolls dissolving, words mixing with the river, drifting out to sea, the knowledge of a civilization mingling with the currents of the world. Maybe that was fitting, for knowledge, like water, cannot be contained. It moves, reshapes, and returns, always finding its way back to light. And so, the story of the Islamic Golden Age remains unfinished. Its brilliance still flickers in every act of inquiry, every search for truth, every hand that reaches beyond fear toward understanding. Civilizations rise and fall, but the hunger for knowledge, that is eternal.